Welcome to social psychology. This is actually one of my favorite subjects that we are going to cover. I leave it to the end because, again, I think it's fun to end with a bang. I hope that, I just want to take a minute to say I hope that you've enjoyed this semester. I hope that you've gotten something out of it, not just book knowledge, but actually contextual knowledge of how psychology actually does affect your life every day. And that's kind of what we come down to with social psychology, is learning how from the time you were really, really small, social psychology was influencing you. And so let's start by taking a look. So we start out with the idea of social influence, ways in which a person can be affected by other people. We start out by looking at conformity, changing one's own behavior to more closely match the actions of others. There was a guy by the name of Solomon Asch, and there's actually in this chapter, there's going to be 3 names that you're going to need to become familiar with. Solomon Asch is the first, and he is famous for his study on conformity. What he did was he brought in individuals and told them they were going to participate in an experiment on visual judgment. So 7 participants came into the room, but actually only one of the subjects, who specifically was sat next to last in the row of people, he was the only person who did not know what was going on. Everybody else in the room was what we call a confederate. They knew what the experiment was about, and they knew they had a job basically to do. So the true participant, the true person that they were looking at in the research, was this one person who sat next to the last. They were asked to compare, basically I'm going to put all these up. They were asked to compare 3 lines to an original line that they were shown. I'm going to show you that really fast. So here is what they were shown. They were given both of these slides, and they were told to which line closely matches this one. Is it A, B, or C? Well, my guess is most of you are going to say, well, it's B, and that would be correct. However, in Asch's experiment, the first 5 subjects all picked the wrong line. They might have said A. A, 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 A. Now it was time for the real subject to pick the line, and most of the time, at least 70% of the time, he picked the same wrong line as the others did. We're going to watch this in a video, but one thing to note, cultural and gender differences in the study. Basically, do you think that men would do this more or less often than women? And what the research shows us is that there really is not much of a gender difference. Both men and women often conformed at the same level. Sometimes women would do a little bit more if it had to be in public, and you'll see what I mean when you watch the video. So let's watch this.
Okay, I want to give you a test of your visual acuity, your sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is tell me which line A, B, and C is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to agree with, to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of length of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2,
2, 2, 3,
3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2.
2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1,
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. 1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why
2.
should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1, 2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
So, as you can see in the video on conformity actually does take a place a lot. And you probably actually have conformed. If your friends were trying to tell you something, you might have gone along with it even if you didn't think it was a good idea. Well, another way of which we're influenced is through the next concept, which is called groupthink. This thinking is the kind of thinking that occurs when people place basically more importance on maintaining group cohesiveness than on assessing the facts of the problem with which the group is concerned. In other words, they dismiss other alternatives. Your book talks about this really briefly when they talk about after 9/11, when the World Trade Center came down. Basically, George W. Bush and his administration decided to go in and bomb Iraq. Now, not everybody thought that this was a good idea, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. And so because everybody was in a room and there was so much pressure, nobody spoke out against it. And so they went ahead and did that. Other times that this has occurred in history that we just know for a fact, believe it or not, the Titanic. There were people who knew that there were not enough lifeboats. But you know what? Nobody wanted to go against, the Titanic can't sink. It's an unsinkable ship. Another thing I think your book talks about is, the Challenger disaster. They actually made a movie about this. I don't think it was a very good movie, but most of you were not alive when the Challenger disaster happened. That is when one of the space shuttles blew up. It was all because there was a ring called an O-ring that was cracked. And so that caused the explosion. However, people were aware before that the O-ring had problems. And because the group was bigger, they didn't want to accept that answer. And so they just kind of put it aside and said, oh, it will be fine. What can an O-ring do? What really is that going to harm anything? Well, it ended up costing the lives of astronauts. So that is groupthink. There are some basic symptomology, according to Irving Janis, of when group thinking is occurring. So just be aware. Invulnerability. Basically, members feel they cannot fail. They are infallible. Again, they cannot be wrong. They will rationalize, absolutely rationalize why they think they are right. Stereotypes. Members stereotype their enemies as weak, stupid, or unreasonable. So again, if you don't agree with them, then you're the problem. And insularity. Members prevent the group from hearing disruptive but potentially useful information from people who are outside the group. And so they really insulate the group from other information. Another concept to look at is called group polarization, which is a tendency for groups' predominant opinion to become stronger and more extreme after an issue is discussed. The next thing we're going to look at is deindividuation, which is reduction of self-awareness and personal responsibility that can occur when a person is a part of a group and feels anonymous. Probably one of the biggest experiments ever done that you will, again, one of those names you need to remember, is Philip Zimbardo and the Stanford Prison Experiment. There was a movie made about this also, and so if you are familiar with that, you will know what I'm talking about. In this famous experiment, basically people behaved in a way that, especially the people who were made into what we called them prison guards, they behaved in a way that was very dehumanizing to the prisoners. However, because it was part of a group, they basically didn't take ownership or responsibility for it. So why don't you watch Phil Zimbardo as he talks about his experiment.
In 1971, in the basement of the psychology department of Stanford University, a mock prison was created. It rivaled all social psychology experiments in controversy.
Shortly after I finished this Stanford Prison study, Milgram embraced me and said, "I'm so happy that you did this." He said, because now you can take off some of the heat that he's had to bear alone of having done the most unethical study.
Although this experiment is over 30 years old, its enduring power has been underscored by the events at Abu Ghraib.
When we got to Abu Ghraib, it was eerie. People were being told to rough up Iraqis that wouldn't cooperate. I mean, they're torturing, they're abusing detainees. You're looking at the situation thinking, they've condoned this, but why? And if it wouldn't have been for those photos, no one would have ever believed what was going on over there.
When I first saw the pictures, immediately a sense of familiarity struck me, because I knew that I had been there before. I'd been in this type of situation. I knew what was going on in my mind.
The photographs were strikingly familiar to the photographs that we had taken, many of the photographs I had taken in the prison study.
We didn't do any of the stuff that you see in Abu Ghraib where they, get into a big pile or something like that. But I certainly subjected them to all kinds of humiliations. I don't know where I would have stopped myself. Given enough time, we could have got there.
When the images of the abuse and torture at Abu Ghraib were revealed, immediately the military went on the defensive, saying, it's a few bad apples. When we see somebody doing bad things, we assume they were bad people to begin with. But what we know in our study is there are a set of social psychological variables that can make ordinary people do things they never could imagine doing.
At Abu Ghraib, ordinary people perpetrated extraordinary abuses. To understand why, it helps to reach back to the lessons of Zimbardo's experiment, how people respond to a cruel environment without clear rules.
I think he and everybody else who came down into that situation got caught up into that situation. And the sense that this was an experiment, that began to fade away. It became just life.
We frankly didn't anticipate what was going to happen. We tried to really test the power of the environment to change and transform otherwise normal people, much as Milgram had changed or transformed otherwise normal people in an obedience situation. We wanted to do it in a prison-like situation.
Over 70 men volunteered for Zimbardo's experiment.
And they completed a battery of psychological tests. We picked 24 who were the most normal and most healthy. Half are going to be guards, half are going to be prisoners. And it's like flipping a coin. And heads, this one's a guard, this one's a prisoner. So at the beginning, there's no difference in the kinds of people who are in your two groups.
When we were given our jobs as guards, we were issued a uniform, which was a plain sort of khaki or lighter colored uniform.
And then we gave them the symbols of power, handcuffs, a whistle, a big billy club. And then the other thing we gave them were silver reflecting sunglasses.
When you have mirror sunglasses on, then nobody can see your eyeballs. I think that anytime you put on what essentially is a mask, and you mask your identity, then it allows you to behave in ways that you would not behave if you didn't have the mask on.
To make it more realistic, I had arranged with the Palo Alto Police Department to make mock arrests.
When I was arrested, it was a surprise to me. I didn't think I was going to be brought to an actual police station. I didn't think I was going to go through a booking process.
The guards then put a blindfold on them, stripped them naked, and then they put them in dresses with smocks and underpants. Each had a number that replaced their name. They had to know the number. They could only be referred to by that number. And they had a chain on one foot, which was put there to remind them at all times of their loss of freedom. So all of these things produces a sense of being dehumanized. On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. I mean, the guards felt awkward giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners start giggling.
I don't want anybody laughing.
And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoners named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be. I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough. Stop.
We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
There was the first evening a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as dangerous prisoners. And so the guards formulated a plan, used fire extinguishers, took the doors down, dragged the prisoners out, stripped them naked, and essentially broke the rebellion in a purely physical way.
From that point on, the study was as remarkable a series of events as I've ever seen. It was a real laboratory for Zimbardo and I to watch human nature transformed in a very rapid way in the face of a very powerful situation.
People really suffered. I mean, guards did terrible things to the prisoners. They punished them by putting them in solitary confinement, which was a small closet. You could squat or stand, but you couldn't sit, and it was dark and dank, actually.
Every hour, every day, there's a teeny little bit more of an increment. And they're stepping up, taunting the prisoners. They're stepping up. The count's not letting them sleep. They're stepping up. I don't think from 1 minute to the next, the people who are in it see change and see the difference.
And then the next key thing happened beside the rebellion. Prisoner 8612, he was the first one to have an emotional breakdown.
I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. Don't you know? I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside. Help me now!
At the time, if you had questioned me about the effect I was having, I would say, well, they must be a wimp. They're weak, or they're faking. Because I wouldn't have believed that what I was doing could actually cause somebody to have a nervous breakdown. It was just us sort of getting our jollies with it. Let's be like puppeteers here. Let's make these people do things.
What if I told you to get down on that floor and fuck the floor? What would you do then?
The guards now began to escalate their use of power. Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
They keep thinking of more and more unusual things to do. And very soon after the fourth day, things begin to turn sexual.
You be the bride of Frankenstein, and you be Frankenstein. I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love the true man.
If you want to fully sort of humiliate somebody, then you want to get them in those things where their biggest fears are. And a lot of us have a lot of sexual hang-ups, and so that was part of that effort to humiliate them even further.
Get up, bro.
I love you, true man. I love you, true man.
You're smart, true man. You get down here and do 10.
The guards knew that had the coin come up heads rather than tails, they would have had the dress on rather than the uniform on. They knew that. So they certainly knew that the prisoners who were being mistreated had done nothing wrong to deserve the mistreatment. And yet the roles themselves were so powerful and the environment itself was so powerful that they ended up punishing those prisoners as though they had done something wrong.
We were told to chant something about how he was a bad prisoner. And at the time I went along with it, I'm thinking, what does this matter? We don't believe this, but we can go along and chant it.
Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself is the best. Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself is the best.
That night, he had a breakdown. Every day after that, another prisoner broke down in a similar way. Broke down. I mean, extreme stress reaction. We released another one on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Nobody who was in that study could deny that the prisoner breakdowns were genuine. They were scary to see. They were upsetting to us. They were unexpected, but they were very clearly the real thing. At some level, we understood that something was happening that we were no longer in control of. It was damaging people. We didn't quite have a grasp on what to do about it. One of the mistakes we made was that we hadn't built in time to step back and to look at what was happening and call it what it was, which was mistreatment. We were caught up in the events that were taking place.
Or you can keep your blankets, and 416 will stay in another day. We got 3, guess 1. Keep your blankets, 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
On the 5th day of the study, Zimbardo invited his girlfriend, recent psychology graduate Christina Maslach, to visit the mock prison.
I had heard bits and pieces from Phil about what was going on. And then when I was down there that evening, it really was kind of a wow. The thing that really got to me was when some of the guards took the prisoners down the hall to the men's room.
She looks out and sees a line of the prisoners with paper bags over their heads, each one holding the other one's shoulder.
And they're leading them down the hall. And Phil comes over and look, my God, look at that. And I looked up and something about it just, again, it was the dehumanizing, demeaning kind of treatment. I couldn't watch it.
And she said, it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. And she got tears in her eyes. I said, what? And she runs out. And I'm furious. I'm saying, look, this is, I run outside. We have this big argument. I'm saying, look, this is dynamics of human behavior. Look, it's fascinating, the power of the situation. So I'm giving her all the psychological basis. And what kind of psychologist are you? You don't appreciate this. And she said,
I don't understand. You're a stranger to me. I don't understand this. How could you not see what I see? I mean, you're a caring, compassionate person. I know you from all these other things. Something's gone wrong here.
And then the next thing she said, which had an equally big impact, is, I'm not sure I want to, have anything to do with you if this is the real you. And that was like a slap in the face, because what she was saying is, you've changed. The power of the situation has transformed you from the person I thought I knew to this person that I don't know. And at that moment, I said, wow, you're right. We got to end it.
After only 6 days, Dr. Zimbardo shut down his experiment.
As you can tell, Zimbardo's experiment was pretty terrible. It's actually considered one of the most unethical experiments ever made because of the what it put its people through, especially the people who were playing the role of the prisoners, to cause those people to actually have mental breakdowns. That's a problem, right? So it's just something, again, to kind of keep in mind. Here's a question for you. What do you think you would do if you were put in the same situation? Something to think about. Okay, let's move on to the next concept, which is compliance. Okay, so compliance is changing one's behavior as a result of other people directing or asking for that change. So we're going to start, there's a couple of different kinds of compliance, and the first one is foot in the door technique or foot in the door phenomenon. It is where we ask for a small commitment, and after gaining a compliance, asking for a bigger commitment. Okay, so an example of this. Let's say your neighbor comes over and says, hey, I'm going out of town. Would you mind picking up my mail every day for me? Well, that doesn't sound like that big of a job. So you go, sure, why not? I can do that for you. Oh, great. If you're doing that, can you also go in it and feed my pet alligator Spike? Wait a minute, I agreed to do this little job, and then they asked me to do a bigger job. That is called foot in the door, okay? Let's see what the next one is. Door in the face technique is asking for a large commitment being refused, and then asking for a smaller commitment. Okay, so I have a very personal story that goes with this. Several years ago, my husband and the boys and I, we went to an appliance store, and we were there to look for a refrigerator, but while we were there, my husband goes, hey, can I go look at the flat screen TVs? And this honestly was when flat screen TVs, the big ones, were just starting to become pretty popular. And so I'm like, sure, not a problem, go look, because there's no problem with looking, right? Okay, so anyways, he went and looked, and he came back and he goes, I found a TV. It's 80-inch. And I just looked at him and went, there is no reason that we need an 80-inch screen, flat screen TV. There's just, we don't even have a wall that really is an appropriate size to put that on, that we would be able to sit far enough back away from it to enjoy it appropriately. And so what he did next was key. He goes, well, then can I get the 60-inch? Well, of course I said, 80-inch, 60-inch. Sure, 60-inch, you can look at the 60-inch. So at that point, the boys needed to go and do something, and so I was walking out of the store with them, and all of a sudden realized he just did door-in-the-face technique. I guess good for him, bad for me. So that is an example of that. Okay, another one. Oh, there are three here. Reciprocity, lowball, and that's not all. Okay, so reciprocity. I do for you, you do for me, right? Lowball is when somebody, hey, they give you a really low offer. Let's say you are going to buy a car. Okay, so they give you a really low price, and you go, okay, I can do that. But then they start adding all of these fees in, right? But it's not just fees, it's all these other expenditures. You know what? If you want the tires, we're going to add money onto that. And so, again, giving you a really low thing, but then adding a bunch of stuff on. That's not all. Have any of you ever watched an infomercial? Hey, if you order right now, we will give you not just one, but 2 free sets of whatevers, Ginsu knives, right? So it's order right now, order in the next 50 seconds, and we will give you such a deal. That's not all. So those are ways that we are encouraged to comply, or we are influenced through compliance. The last one we're going to look at is obedience, which is changing one's behavior at the command of an authority figure. Remember I told you there were 3 names. The first one was Ash. The second one was Phil Zimbardo. Now we have our third name, Stanley Milgram, and he did a very famous experiment on obedience. In fact, before Zimbardo, he was seen as having one of the most unethical experiments. And so in his experiment, and if you guys were in a classroom with me right now, I'd have 3 volunteers up, and we would be kind of role-playing this to help give you an example. You're going to watch it on video in just a minute, but bear with me. Let's try to follow along. There are 3 people: the experimenter, the learner, and the teacher, okay? The experimenter, he wears, or she wears, a lab coat. That gives them the sense that they're in charge, they have authority, and they're the ones that set the conditions. They're the ones that basically tell the rules, okay? And basically they're telling the person that is coming in, there's one person who's not in on it, and that is the teacher, okay? They tell the teacher the testing effect of punishment on learning and memory is what they're looking at. So the teacher is told that they are to punish any wrong answers with ever-increasing shocks. What they have is they have this really cool machine with all these cool labels on it, and the labels are different voltages. And so every time the learner, which is, by the way, the learner is on another side of a curtain, so the teacher can't see the learner, they can just hear the learner. So every time they ask the learner a question, when the learner responds with the incorrect answer, the teacher gives them a little shock. Well, every time the answer is wrong, the shock increases with voltage, okay? So the teacher is also given a real 45-volt shock in order to see that the thing is real. However, what the teacher does not know is that, I told you, the learner is actually in on it. As soon as the teacher leaves that part of the room, the learner takes off all of the material and everything is pretty much pre-recorded. The rest of the shocks aren't real, but the teacher doesn't know that. The machine is labeled, like I said earlier, and the learner has a script. He or she says things at different shocks. The experimenter has specific scripts and prods as well. So what you will view in this video is as the teacher continues to shock, the learner will start complaining. Ow, it hurts. I have a heart condition. You need to stop. I want out of here. You will see the teacher turn and look at the experimenter. And when they look at the experimenter, because the teacher is wanting basically permission to stop, but the experimenter will say, it is imperative that you continue. So this was Milgram's prediction. Milgram predicted that most would stop at 150 volts. Basically when the learner started protesting. However, 1 in 1,000 would, he also predicted that 1 in 1,000 would go to the extreme voltage of 450 volts. However, the results were much different than Milgram had ever expected. 65% of the teachers went all the way to 450 volts of shocking the learner, or what they thought they were doing. All of them went to at least 300 volts. By the way, there was no gender difference. Men and women both did the very same.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening.
but the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let
Dance.
me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of here.
boy.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me out.
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
As you can tell, the Milgram experiment was pretty unethical because, the poor teacher thought he was actually probably killing the learner. Well, this brings us to the last three concepts we're going to talk about in this section: social facilitation, social impairment, and social loafing. Social facilitation basically is when being in front of people or being around people actually encourages better performance. So think about a musician who actually does not get stage fright. Maybe it helps them come alive when they're in front of an audience, or maybe they're a drama person. If you've ever done a play, you probably fell into one of two categories. Either the play, when you got into the play and was actually doing the performance in front of an audience, you either were super nervous and super scared and felt like you were going to die, or it did just the opposite. It inspired you and you came alive in front of the audience. Part of that's adrenaline. But again, social facilitation is when being in front of others or performing in front of others improves your performance. Social impairment would be just the opposite. That is when, that's the stage fright thing, right? When being in front of people actually causes your performance to decline. So, like when you have to give a speech in class, sometimes our performance declines, right? Social loafing is the very last thing that we're going to talk about. And again, I think you probably have all experienced this at one point or another. It's when your teacher puts you into a group, and there's always that one member, it seems like, who doesn't hold their weight, right? Who doesn't carry their weight. That would be social loafing. Okay, that is it for this section. I want you just to take a minute, though, and name that researcher. What does Ash, Milgram, and Zimbardo each have? What did they study? Well, if you guessed Ash and conformity, you were right. How about Milgram? Obedience. And Zimbardo was de-individuation. Okay, we'll see you in the next slideshow.